All right. Well, thanks again, everyone. If you've just joined, we're excited to have you. We uh, have a great session planned today on access control and permission management in Looker, which is a multifaceted topic with lots of different options. So, looking forward to discussing some of the pros and cons for how to do that in Looker today. If you're just joining us, I will put the channel link for our Slack channel where we'll be doing Q&A at the end of our time together today. So we have a Slack workspace for Spectacles where we try to have conversations around these webinars in individual channels. So if you're not in the Slack already, you can join via the link in Zoom chat. If you are, we'll be in the channel webinar and security access. You can post questions there. So we'll keep this part pretty quick and let Dylan get into the actual content here. But just so you know, we do these kinds of webinars about every 2 weeks. They are focused generally on topics of interest for intermediate and advanced Looker developers. So we're really trying to just create interesting discussions around getting deeper into Looker and all of its functionality. So we try to keep them pretty short so that you can't actually join them during a work day. We try to keep them to around 30 minutes plus maybe 5-10 minutes of questions after. And the next two that we have coming up, next one will be on how to use LookML within Looker Studio. It's a pretty recent feature from Looker, and want to walk people through, if you aren't using Looker Studio or you want to be using Looker Studio, formerly Data Studio, how to do that. And then one after that will be actually not us presenting, but some folks from a company called Assurance speaking about how they use hub and spoke Looker architecture, which is a common way to set up your Looker instance with multiple projects to scale Looker work at their organization. And you can sign up for these. You can sign up for these webinars on our website at spectacles.dev/webinars. Cool. So without further ado, I'll introduce our speaker today, my co-founder, Dylan Baker. Dylan is a wealth of knowledge about Looker. He's been working in Looker across many different companies in consulting roles and as a hired head of data for about 7 years. He was one of the early Looker customers in the UK. And so he's really seen, I don't know if I can say you've seen it all, but you've seen almost all of it. And so looking forward to learning from him today about this topic. So I'll hand it over to Dylan and we can get started.
Awesome. Thanks, Josh. Hello, everyone. Really excited to be talking with all of you today. As Josh said, we're going to be kind of covering a whole range of security and access related things in Looker today. So we're going to go through kind of types of controls and permissions. We're going to do a quick overview of Looker objects. These will probably both be things you know already, but it's just helpful scene setting for the rest of this webinar. We're then going to talk about kind of groups, roles, permission sets, and model sets. So I think what many of us think of as like the standard way to set permissions in Looker. We're then going to do a brief introduction to user attributes. And then we're going to talk about access grants, access filters, and other types of filters, which are possibly kind of slightly more advanced ways of setting permissions in Looker. At the end of this webinar, you're not necessarily going to have like the holy grail of how to set up security in Looker. The reason for that is it's going to differ a lot on a company by company basis and what types of data you have and who should have access to what and things like that. What I really hope you'll have by the end of this today is a really good understanding of the things available to you to set up whatever the best system for you is, so that you're really aware of like, hey, these are all the options available to myself. This is how some best practices around those things, and really go from there. And if you have any questions, things that I don't cover during this, as Josh said, please just head to the Slack channel, ask them there. We will, between us, try to answer as many of those as possible after the kind of presentation portion of today. So let's jump in. We're roughly going to be talking about permissions and controls in a couple different ways today. So the first is, what can users do in Looker? What are they able to, what actions are they able to take, and to some degree, kind of like what can they see? And then we're going to talk about what users can access. And that's going to be split into a couple different kind of a couple different vectors. One's going to be models, explorers, and even actually views, dimensions, measures. So the actual tables and columns that they can see. And then the other part, which I think we talk about less when we talk about Looker security, but can actually be really powerful, and in certain cases you 100% need, like in embed use cases, is talking about whether they can access certain rows. And so we're going to kind of break this down into those two. What tables or explorers, what sandboxes can they see, what columns can they see, and then we're gonna talk about what data within those, what rows can they actually see there. So let's start by taking a step back and just kind of doing a bit of scene setting as to how Looker works. Now, I expect most of you on this call know all of this already. This is a useful kind of mental model as we talk about kind of setting permissions on things. And so Looker has the concept of a Looker project that I don't have here. But each project then has a series of models. And from a Looker permission point of view, projects don't play a massive role into it. The kind of highest level that you'll typically set permissions is at the model level. And that's because models are kind of like namespace unique across your Looker instance. No two models, people may not know this, but no two models across different projects can have the same names. You can't across a whole instance have two models that have the same name, even if they're in different projects. And most of the time, the highest level you can set these permissions, as we'll talk about in roles in just a second, is at that model level. And so you have models. Models within them will have one or many explorers. Explorers will be made up of one or many views. And then within those views, you have typically one or many dimensions and or measures, and typically multiple of both. And so in Looker, you can actually set security at almost any level within this. We're going to talk about roles first in a second, where you can really largely set them at the model level. But then there's a whole bunch of other security functionality that many people aren't aware of that allow you to set stuff at a much more granular level that can be really useful if you're experimenting with new explorers or have sensitive things that you need people to not have access to, or whatever it may be. So the first thing we're going to jump into is groups, roles, permission sets, and model sets. Now, this is the kind of quote unquote standard way, I think, for most organizations, particularly when you're getting started with permissions in Looker, is to go down this path. Roles are what ship by default with Looker. You get 4 roles. You get the admin role, developer role, viewer role, and user role. And so even organizations that give kind of, I don't want to say no thought, but kind of less thought about this stuff will be thinking about at least those 4 roles to begin with, because typically it's the way your contracts work. Typically you've bought certain types of each license. And so you don't want to, I mean, 1, you definitely don't want to give everyone admin, but 2, you're kind of, who developers are, that everyone else are users or maybe even viewers. And so at the beginning, that is maybe all you'll have. Lots of companies, particularly if you're getting started with Looker, will just start with that while you're kind of figuring out, if you're new to Looker, you kind of got to figure out this kind of model, explore, view paradigm. And so you may keep it simple and keep it right there. But over time, you may want to make sure that people have access to the right things. And that can, I've been throwing the word security around a little for this, but actually it can also be just because you want to improve the user experience for users in Looker. If you have a lot of Looker explorers, even if you don't mind everyone having access to all of them, it may be that the user experience from a discoverability point of view is going to be much better in your Looker instance if you just give them access, at least initially, to the things they need and have a way for them to ask for access to other things or things like that. I'm sure many of us have had the experience in Looker of going in and seeing 100 explorers and not really knowing where to get started. And that is a non-security reason that you may want to kind of think about this stuff as well. This isn't really just about security. It's about how do we make sure that people get the most out of Looker across our organization. So as I said, this is really kind of the easy and most broad way to set permissions in Looker. A role in Looker is made up of things called permission sets and model sets. And so a role is one permission set and one model set, and that is what makes up a role. And so a permission set is what can people do, I'm going to kind of list what some of those options are in just a second. And the model sets is what models can they do that on? And so the idea is that you could say, hey, someone can, I'm kind of talking at a high level here, but they can see data for these 4 models, or they can download data for these 2 models, or whatever it might be. And so all of those combinations will make up different roles, and then you can assign those roles to different people in your organization. Permission sets kind of have a wide, like a long list of things that you can assign here. The kind of default roles, admin, developer, viewer, and user, have different combinations of these. So you can actually go into your instance as long as you're a Looker admin, and kind of go and see, what those are for the different roles. And what you'll notice here, and this is kind of a somewhat important difference, is that about half of them, mostly on the left-hand side here, have to do with things that they can do to 2 data sets. So on models and on kind of on Explorer. And then the other half are things that they can do instance-wide. So on the left-hand side, you can basically select things that they can do on different models. And so the combination of model set and permission set is going to be important there. Whereas there's things on the right-hand side where they only need to have a single role that grants them that permission for them to be able to kind of do it all over the instance. And so you'll build up these roles based on whatever sets of models and permissions are relevant to your organization, and you can assign those to users. And you do not need to do these in a way such that every user just has one role. Users can have multiple roles assigned to them. So you can often do them at quite like a granular use case by use case basis, and then assign them to, assign multiple to people as they become relevant for different people. You don't need to think about like designing, hey, there's this use case and they need a bit of this and a bit of that and a bit of this. And so I need to design that into one role. You can really think of this as like, hey, someone needs to do this action or this type of data analysis or this type of thing in the instance. That's a role. And then someone's persona in Looker is going to be made up of various of those. As I talked about, Looker ships with 4 of these by default. They ship by admin, developer, user, and viewer. And really what we're going to talk about today is more of like creating your own custom roles that suit your organization. These can be assigned to people directly. And so those of you who have been involved in the like onboarding or user creation side of Looker will know that when someone gets onboarded, you can pick specific roles to them for them. But in that same onboarding, you can pick the groups that are assigned to them. And that is typically actually the way that we'd recommend you think about roles. Looker can become, the admin side of Looker can become very fiddly if you start assigning specific roles to different people over time. It's not impossible, but as you get to a large number of users, you're going to want this all to be as easily auditable and editable as possible. And so we'd highly recommend assigning people to groups and assigning roles to those groups. Groups in Looker, if you're not familiar, are collections of users. Typically, they're going to be bucketed by area of business or desired access level. So maybe it's regions, maybe it's sales, marketing, engineering. Maybe it's just desired access level. So maybe it's admin, developer, user, viewer, and other, just purely access level groups kind of in between those as well. So mapping those groups to the different areas of your business is all going to depend a little on what roles you have, how those roles affect the access to data that they should have, and kind of flow from there. But as much as possible, we'd recommend kind of thinking about this from a group's point of view and managing that way, so that if a group of people that all have a similar trait need access to something, you only need to go and add that to the group or remove it from the group instead of having to go and find the 12 users that's relevant to and do it that way. Oh, sorry, one final thing here. You can set groups with kind of SSO SAML. So if you are an organization that has a bunch of groups designed in Okta or Google Workspace or Active Directory or whatever kind of identity management tool you're using, you can map those all across to Looker and then assign roles to those groups. And that actually saves you as the Looker admin the need to define all these groups. You can kind of inherit them from the work that your IT admins or HR, whoever is setting that up. that's not to say that, the odds that the groups that those people have set in, let's say, Okta map exactly to what you're going to need in Looker are reasonably small, but at least to get started, um, it'll often get you some of the way there. And it means that those groups are automatically going to get set by someone else, which means you have to worry about less of the overhead. And so trying to leverage those as much as possible before you go down into kind of your own custom groups is really useful. And so this kind of paradigm, groups, roles, permission sets, model sets, is going to allow you to set permissions at the model level. So many of you may only have one model in your Looker instance. If I kind of come back up to this graph, many of you may have one. You may only have a small number of explorers and you put them all in one. And that's fine, but it does mean that by default, using this setup, using roles, you'll only be able to grant people access to everything or nothing. And so one way that you may want to think about your models at a high level is roughly a breakdown of permissions. If you know you're an organization that's not going to need to care about this that much, then throw stuff in one model. There are some like LookML performance benefits to splitting some stuff in different models, depending on the size of your project. But what this will allow you to do with roles is grant certain people access to all the explorers in a single model. Which brings us to kind of the second half of stuff, which is like, if I want to get more granular than that, what do I do? And we're going to get to that in just a second, but we're going to take a slight detour via user attributes, just to talk about those, because they're going to be really relevant for the next bits that we're going to talk about. So user attributes may be something that many of you are aware of already. They allow you to customize the Looker experience on a user-by-user basis. And so they are basically what the title suggests, which is they're attributes that get stored and set on every user in your Looker instance. And that, as I say here, can affect performance or the experience that people have in Looker in various ways. And that can be, as we're going to talk about here, what people have access to and what they see. So some of it is aesthetic stuff. It's localization. It's if you've got people across different countries or different time zones, a lot of that is set with user attributes. But there's a lot of other stuff within database connections, within filters and access grants and Liquid and LookML, where these user attributes can be used to affect the kind of experience that people have in Looker, particularly in the way of limiting or expanding what they see in your Looker instance. And so this is what it looks like, or an example of what it looks like for different users. This is in our internal instance. And so we do a lot of work with DBT and we point to different data sets. And so you can see that there's a couple things here. User attributes can be set right at the bottom of the slide here to either invisible, so users don't know what they are, to view only, so people can see what their user attributes are but not edit them, or editable. And so as you kind of go down this path, depending on what the user attribute is for, you may want people to not know that it exists, want people to be able to see it but not edit it, or be able to edit it. An example of one that is or should be editable in our case is if you're a developer and you want to point your Looker instance to different data sets, different databases, different schemas, having your DBT project, your DBT data set user attributes as editable is likely going to be key for making that functionality worthwhile. But maybe you have a region or a team user attribute that you want people to know what it's set to, but you don't really want them to be able to go in and change it, because if you're setting security around these things, only admins should be able to have that control, obviously. So a couple of examples of user attributes are things like team, office region, development database or schema. If you're using Liquid in your SQL to point to different places, you can use user attributes for that. And we do that a ton at Spectacles with our DBT integration in Looker. Or you can have different user attributes that are explicitly to grant access to certain explorers or fields. So this is things like has explore X access. You can set that as a user attribute and then use that in the ways that we're about to talk about to grant access to people. And I'm going to come back to a recurring refrain during this presentation, which is these user attributes can be set at the user level. But most of the time, for most of the stuff that we're going to talk about here, we'd recommend setting these via groups. So you can set group defaults for user attributes and doing it that way so that you can just assign people to the right groups, and all the kind of security and access stuff just flows from there. is really key. And so this is an example of how many of our customers and many DBT and Looker users generally write their LookML in a way that allows people to point it during the development process dynamically to different schemas. So in this case, instead of having analytics hard-coded, you have user attributes, DBT schema, and that inserts into every query the schema that is set on the user attribute. And typically the way this works is every user by default has wherever your production schema is, but then developers, when they're in DBT Dylan or DBT Josh or pointing to a CI data set, can come in and override that so that they can test things in the development process on top of models, DBT models that may not be deployed into production yet. We've got, if you're looking at this, we've got a ton of docs on how to do this on the Spectacles doc site that if you drop us a note in Slack, we can share with you. Perfect. So as I talked about a second ago, roles really allow you to grant access to things at the model level. But if you need to go more granular, there's a bunch of different ways you can do that. So access grants allows you to control things at a more granular level when it comes to LookML objects. So we talked about explorers or views or even individual dimensions or measures. I'm going to run through all of these in kind of detail in a second, but access grants allow you to do that. So if you want to say, hey, everyone has access to this model, but they really shouldn't have access to this explorer except for these 3 people, you can use an access grant to do that. And then we can actually get into the underlying data. So we then have access filters, which is basically what data, or kind of practically speaking, rows should people see based on the user. So based on the user attribute, what should they be able to see or not? And then there's a couple other types of filters that can also be used here if you want to kind of do things more dynamically or need something more custom. And this can be based on the user, or it can also be hard coded. So it's a little slightly different. We'll get into that as well. So taking these one by one, an access grant is basically a way in LookML to say, should someone have access to this thing, this object? In this example, we've got it as an explorer. And I'll talk through this LookML in a second, but it can be explorers, it can be views, it can be dimensions, it can be measures, and it can be joins, which is really just kind of more views, but not the base of an explorer. All of those you can use a required access grant. And so the way that an access grant works is you define something like this in a model file. So you can see here there's a syntax that defines an access grant, and here I've got it called is a MIA employee. And it takes 2 arguments. It takes a user attribute, and you pass the name of the user attribute, and it takes allowed values, and you pass in the strings that ideally will be possible values of this user attribute. And so the idea here is that in this instance, we have a user attribute called region, of which one of the values is EMEA. And this access grant will give people access to whatever it's assigned to if their region user attribute is set to EMEA. Now, this is a list here, so you can comma separate things here. You can provide multiple allowed values, but it needs to match, for someone to kind of get access to something through this, it needs to match all of them. So in this case, it's unlikely that region, someone would match multiple regions, but there are other things where they're going to need to match all the allowed values. I'm sorry, that's not here. That's actually here in the required access grant. Getting ahead of myself. So on the Explorer, the second half of this is you say required access grants, and you then list the access grants that are required. And it's here that you list the multiple things that people need to match. So you may have is a MIA employee and is God, is senior company executive or something like that. And they need to match all of those required access grants. And so effectively, this is a way in this code of saying only EMEA employees can see this order items Explorer. For anyone else, they can't. And so this is a way, if we talk about roles being at the model level, of you doing things at a lower level. And you can assign this required access grant to any of these things that I've talked about, to views, to dimensions, to measures, in joins in an Explorer. And so you can really set this in really custom ways if your organization requires it. One thing to note is that these access grants should be defined in a model file typically. And if they're going to be used across multiple model files, we'd recommend setting up like a placeholder file where you define these things and then just import them elsewhere. You ideally don't want to have to redefine these all over the place, and it's just useful to have them in a single model and import those. If you're interested in kind of what that structure might look like, there's both an old webinar that we did and an old blog that we can share in Slack after around how to structure Looker projects, where we kind of really leverage this import. This includes syntax a lot for stuff like this, so that you really don't want to have to design these things more than once. So where access grants talked about what objects they have access to, the next bit that you may want to do is limit people on certain rows. So you may have sensitive data that certain people should only be able to see things that are relevant to them. And so that's where access filters come in. Access filters are defined in the same way in a Explore. So they're defined in an Explore definition. In this case, they're only defined in an Explore definition. And they limit the rows that someone can see by filtering on a certain field with a certain value. And so you can see the access filter here, again, has kind of two inputs. One's the user attribute it applies to, and one's the field that we need to filter on. And so you pass it here a fully qualified field name from your Explorer, and you say what what user attribute to filter that with. And so in this case, this Explorer might produce a query like this, where this where factorders.region equals EMEA filter is not being, I haven't filtered on that manually myself, and that filter actually doesn't appear in the UI, but because my user has the user attribute region set to EMEA, this query is always going to be filtered on that for me. And so this can be a really useful way of limiting what data people can see across your Looker instances. People use these a lot in embedded use cases where, for let's say you've got 10 customers using your Looker instance in an embedded capacity. You only want them to see data relevant to them. And so you'll have a customer column in every Explorer, and you'll have an access filter on that at the Explorer level. So there's really no way that user could ever see any data that is not relevant to them. The key bit here is that these values must exist in the underlying data set. So I, in this case, have to have a region column and a region, therefore, dimension that I can filter on, which is kind of how this all works. So you need to have this mapping of like enums in a column, so like different possible values in a column in your warehouse and what they map up to in your user attributes in Looker. And so there's a bit of kind of manual work there to make sure those are in sync. Typically, if you're using something like dbt to model that, you may have a test to say like, hey, these are the only possible allowed values for this column, and you make sure that those always match your user attributes in Looker. And then the third category here I have, which is like other filters, which is ways that you can use user attributes, particularly in Liquid, to do more custom stuff here. And so there's two in particular that I think are useful: SQL always where and SQL always having. Which are like the access filter, except you can put any arbitrary SQL in there. There are a couple others called conditional filter and things like that work in a similar way, but these are the two that people typically fully can't change, which is why it's key to a security model. And these are useful if you have multiple or kind of a unique combination of user attributes that you want people to be able to filter off of. So you can see here, I'm saying where regions, order regions is the same as the user attributes region. So that's the same as the access filter I had above. But there's then there is God user attribute that we have, which is someone who can come in and do everything in the instance. And so if you want to have this or logic, or maybe there's like even more complex, you'd be amazed by how complex these things can get. In some instances we've seen, you can just put whatever logic you want in here. And so if you're not familiar with it, this kind of double curly brace syntax here is how you access user attributes in Liquid. You can use them all over LookML like this, and we may at some point do another webinar on just that. But you can do either SQL always where or SQL always having in any complex way you want here using user attributes, or the more common use case for these is with hard-coded values. So the other option that I've seen some people do, and I don't love as much because it creates more Looker objects, but you could have order items EMEA and order items North America, and you could just grant people access to the different ones with access grants at the Explorer level, and then just hard code a fact orders.region equals North America in one or EMEA in the other. There are some, I think, reasons to do that. If you don't want to, if you're more comfortable easy using access grants or just fully having different models for them and using roles at the higher level for that. So if you don't want to get involved in user attributes, that may be a reason to do it. But typically, I think having a single explorer where you just kind of have these filters is really useful. You can use wildcards for admins. And so there's a slightly different wildcard for each user attribute type. But for strings, it's either star or null. For numbers, it's greater than 0, less than 0. It's or null. There's things like that. So that if you want to have admins who aren't bound to a specific region, it will check that. So let's jump into some recommendations. No organization is the same. And so as I kind of talked about earlier, these are really the tools you have to figure out what's going to work for you. Trying to be as proactive as possible in your organization, I think, can be helpful here. It's kind of hard to clean this up after, particularly if people have built content on things that you ultimately want to revoke from them in the future. So trying to do this with as much like forethought as you can. But ultimately, it's, I think, about your organization and your teams getting together and thinking, okay, what is the trade-off that we want to make from a UX and a security point of view? You know, do we want people to just have access to everything? Do we want to limit it? Why do we want to limit it? And then, you know, oh, we're using SAML, we can use these groups or not. There's a whole bunch of considerations there. But ultimately, the system you design for yourself is likely to be some combination of the stuff that we've talked about here. Leverage groups as much as possible. Use them to assign roles, use them to assign user attributes. Groups are really your friend. And if you can leverage groups from an identity provider that's going to auto-update, that's, I think, kind of the ideal setup, and trying to lean on that as much as possible will probably make your life easier going forward. Use roles for broad access and then user attribute-based solutions for more granular access. You can go down the path of like every Explorer having its own user attribute that says like has access to X. And I've seen people do this, and then basically what you have access to is just a bunch of yes, no fields on your user. I think that becomes pretty cumbersome to manage. It can be overkill. So there is probably like use roles for the rough categories and then use user attributes to toggle things either at the row level or at the kind of object level for whatever you want. And then just reiterating, like, if you can and if it makes sense, it often requires a bit of collaboration with your IT or HR teams, whoever it might be. But like having these groups set up when someone joins the company so that they know like, oh, this person in this type of role should have this access, can make your life much easier. And so like kicking off a project where you just get all that set up to begin with and then just make your life easier in the future is I think to be recommended. And then there's a final thing I want to talk about, which is like kind of related to all of this. We did a webinar about Looker Deployer ages ago. For those of you who aren't familiar, Looker Deployer is a way of kind of both versioning and deploying things from local files on your machine to a Looker instance. And what's really cool about Looker Deployer is you can pull down your groups, your roles, all that stuff, and actually deploy them back up to a Looker instance using Looker Deployer as well. And so if your Looker instance from a security point of view is getting really complex, which happens at like even a pretty small number of users if you have kind of some security concerns around all this stuff and sensitive data, version controlling it and deploying up as part of some CI process can be a bit of effort to set up, but is actually can be really, really effective at you having a history of, you know, what your setup was, allows you to roll back to different things. And so if you're going down this path, very happy for you to come talk to us. The team at Bytecode, of which I think there may be some on the call today, have also, they do a lot of the work on Looker Deployer right now and will also, I'm sure, have thoughts on this. But it's a really interesting way if you want the kind of auditability and the ability to roll back and to do all that type of stuff. You really can set up some quite cool systems with something like Looker Deployer to pull roles down, to push them back up, and to kind of edit them in text in one go, and kind of go off that as your source of truth, if that's something that may be suitable to your organization. I actually built a thing called Looker Access. It's got to be 5 years ago now, to do exactly this at a company that I worked at. This was before Gazer or Looker Deployer existed, which is certainly what I would have used at the time if it did. But we needed to have an audit trail of who had access to what, when, and be able to kind of prove things like that. We were a financial institution. And this type of system where basically the only way that we asked people to make changes to roles was in the code. You then made a pull request to kind of get that change validated. And then when you merge that pull request, it pushed something up to Looker. Something to explore, and very happy to kind of help out with anyone who's thinking of going in that direction. And that's it from me, hopefully in a decent amount of time. But we'll jump to the Q&A with Josh and I will go and seek from the Slack channel. So if you do have any questions, I hope some of you will have asked some as we went, but equally, if you have some now, please, head to the Slack channel and ask them there.
Cool. Thanks, Dylan. I'm going to post the Slack link one more time, just in case. Awesome. We've got a number of questions here, so we will move right along. The first one is, when limiting view access, would you prefer using OAuth and setting up access via the database, or would you add a required access grant to the LookML of the view?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. So I can't remember off the top of my head how many of the databases allow for kind of OAuth to the database. But there's definitely BigQuery, possibly Snowflake, and I'm sure a couple others. For those who aren't familiar, the concept here is that each user gets their own user at the database level. They have permission set there, and then you kind of queries through Looker get run as your own database user, and you can set row level permissions there. I think it depends a little on whether it's the same team managing Looker and the underlying warehouse. I think if you are just responsible for Looker, I think I'd probably recommend the system that requires the least friction, which is kind of like controlling it all yourself. I think if you've got a really good relationship with the team that's upstream, you could sort that out as well. But I think typically, unless you've got really sophisticated like user management systems across all of your infrastructure, having everyone have a user at the database level can feel cumbersome and a lot to manage. And so kind of like managing it through Looker has typically been my preference, unless there's a overwhelmingly compelling reason to not do that.
Yeah, I would +1 that. I think like an example of where you might want to go all the way to OAuth is also think about if there's trouble, if the user has access to that table outside of Looker, right? So if I can query the database, but I can't see PHI, for example, that might be a good case for OAuth, because you probably just want to set that access restriction at the database and not just in Looker. You want to set it everywhere. But if it's just, if it's just more sort of general, I don't want the marketing team to see the finance data or something like that, you might start with the access grants and go from there. Cool. Another question about groups. So can you have several license types of Looker users in the same group?
Yes. So I'm trying to figure out the answer to that. Yes, though I guess like only by granting people things that are beneath their license type, that are like of a lower license type. So you could have a user license type, just kind of like an explorer, who's going to have view only access to something else. And so you have like a viewer license type role that grants to that. And you grant that to the explorers because they should have view only access to that thing. That user, because they have like explorer abilities elsewhere, will be considered a user, but they may be added to a viewer group that only other of which some members are just viewers. So in theory, yeah, you can grant certain things to certain people. Similarly, if you have a developer who only has access to certain things, you could give them explore access. They've got develop access on certain things and explore access or view access elsewhere. But yeah, so you can basically grant people things, I think, that would be, I'm trying to figure this out on the fly, but like below their license roles that have permissions below their license type that may also have people of just that lower license type in it.
Cool. Cat Nova asks, so if you're trying to automate something like onboarding users from a GCP workspace group, and you want to set their groups via SAML, like how much of that is something that you could Terraform through the API?
I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. I've done a fair bit of work, or some work with Terraform and a lot of work with Looker, but I've actually never done it together. So I would need to look at, I think there is a Looker Terraform provider. And so it's really just like whether there are things, assets in there that allow you to do that. I don't know the answer off the top of my head. We have some customers who do stuff with Terraform, and Looker, actually a lot of work. So Kat, if you're interested, we may be able to intro you there as well or get the answer from there. But yeah, it's not something I know the answer to off the top of my head. It really just depends on whether Terraform has, or Terraform or someone who has built a Terraform provider for Looker has built out kind of the way to control those things.
Great. So let us know, Kat. Okay, she says that'd be great. Awesome. Next question, is there a way with access grants to do an OR condition so that two user attributes could be evaluated? So the example that Tom gave was, is EMEA employee, which looks at both the region user attribute and a is developer user attribute.
So as far as I'm aware, no, this is where you'd want to have like a SQL always where you write that in yourself with a combination of like SQL, LookML, and Liquid. That's kind of one of the core use cases where you probably need to move away from as far as I'm aware, a access filter and move to one of the other ones, like a SQL always where, and write that out kind of in a slightly more verbose way. You could set it up with an access filter where this is kind of a roundabout answer to the question, but if you want all developers to be able to see everything, for is a me employee, you would you put a wildcard in the like region user attribute for all developers. So if you have a developer group, you could assign that default value to all members of that group, and they would get access to the is a EMEA employee and all others technically. But yeah, if you wanted to do an OR explicitly, I think you would need to use a SQL always where.
Cool. The next question is, what's the best practice for referencing user attributes in the model when it comes to PDTs and NDTs? Are there ways to grant wildcards to the regenerator?
I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. I mean, yeah. What's my first time? I'm just reading the question here in Slack. I don't know. I did look at this ages ago and I can't remember. So the question is like for PDTs and NDTs where stuff is being persisted, is there a way to grant wildcards to the regenerator? I think I would need to go check that, but I think if you're persisting things, Looker is going to get really weird if you've got user attributes in there, because it's only going to try to persist a single version of the PDT or the NDT. And the fact that there's a user attribute in there is going to either do weird things to the cache or like serve people bad. It's either going to serve a version of the PDT that you don't want it to serve because it's for another user attribute, or it's going to see that the cache is see that it's a different PDT each time and try to rebuild it. So this is like I'm 50% confident answer, but I think it would do pretty weird things if you're trying to persist a derived table that uses user attributes. And I imagine the best practice is to not persist them, to use non-persisted, just normal derived tables for those PDTs and NDTs. Barak saying that it produced a different PDT for each user. That may well be the case. I'd certainly need to go look at it. It's possible that for each possible query, it goes and generates a PDT. It's not something we've done a ton of work with.
Got it. Alex, I'm going to skip over your question because it sounds like it was answered, but if that's not the case, just reply in your thread and we can come back to it. There's another one that came through Zoom that I'm going to ask. So you mentioned leveraging SSO to automatically assign users to groups. Is there a way to also automatically assign user attributes based on SSO, or to assign user attributes to all members of a group automatically?
Yeah, so you can assign a default value for a user attribute to a group. And so the idea would be you do that, you say, hey, this group should always have region be EMEA. And when by SSO they get assigned to that group, that user attribute will automatically get set. So that is what we'd recommend is like if you're going to go down the SSO SAML route, is assign default values to the groups and then just let SSO take care of everything else from there.
Nice. In the same vein, so Emmanuel asks, what's the best way to manage user attributes? Where do you store them and manage the different ones and potential values, particularly if you're a big enterprise customer with lots of different options?
Yeah. In whatever source of documentation, people are going to be able to find it most easily. Like if you use Confluence, it's Confluence. If you use Notion, it's Notion. If you have a like a data cataloging tool where it lets you put stuff like this and kind of connect these things, maybe in there. I was just going to look. I think there's a description field on the user attributes in Looker. Let me just go and double check that. But I think so. In theory, you could like in the there's a label. No, so it doesn't even let you kind of point to something and say, hey, here's the stuff. Yeah, I think I don't know, slightly coy, but my answer would be just like wherever you do documentation, and I don't want to tell anyone how to do data documentation. I think it's a hard problem and very few people do it particularly well, but like wherever your team keeps stuff like this, there's no like great solution.
I will say you
certainly
can get and update user attributes via the API. So it's possible to script out something where you could kind of fetch them all and display them tidily or configure them as code somehow, but you would have to all be homegrown. There's nothing really right now that.
Yeah, I think you could use Looker Deployer for that. So it's like a use case that if you want to version control this stuff, like stick some machine readable code in your Looker instance or in another instance, version it there and have that be the way that you control user attributes. Like this whole, I think a bugbear with this whole section of like the Looker ecosystem is that this stuff isn't version controlled. And so if you're going to go down the path of version controlling this stuff, you're going to want to use like Looker Deployer, or as Josh said, do what I did 5 years ago and roll out something yourself to do this. But it is just simply an area where like version control is core to Looker in other areas. It's just not core to Looker here.
Cool. I'm going to revisit one question quickly that I skipped over. So Jake Beresford asks, we have a lot of users who want access to Explore data, but they're not producing dashboards. And the cost per seat for user access is becoming prohibitive for our organization. Are there any strategies for managing seat count that you can share?
I'm just rereading that to make sure I understand it. I like if they're in Looker every day, genuinely exploring, I don't think there's a great strategy here. Like they're not producing dashboards, but they are doing an activity which is exploring data that is going to put them in that license group. And so I think if like all these people are daily active users, there probably isn't a ton available to you there. I think people have commented this, but like I think it's key, and Jake, we'd love to chat with you because we've been thinking of doing some work in this area. Like using the history explorers and the system activity explorers in Looker to identify users who can be demoted from a user to a viewer, or maybe even a developer to a user. That's key. And we're Tom, I think, has answered your question to some in the chat. But yeah, Jake, drop us a message because we're doing a ton of thinking around this area. Ultimately, it's like just getting people down, having some process that gets people down, either disabling if they're not using, or gets them down into the right license group if they are. And if they're using but not using to the full extent that they are entitled to in their current license, those are really the options. But yeah, as I said, we're kind of actively thinking about building something in this area. So would love to chat. That goes to anyone who is, coming up on renewal or anything like that and wants to chat about their license usage.
Cool. Well, we're going to wrap there. Thank you, everyone, for attending today and for the engaging discussion in Slack. It was fun to have some back and forth in some of the threads as well. So appreciate you attending. Just a reminder to check out our upcoming webinars at spectacles.dev/webinars. Go sign up for the next ones, and we will see you all soon. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.